welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue, bringing you into another week here in July. A couple episodes coming your way. It's been a busy month. It's been a busy summer when it comes to the recruiting conversation. We're going to do that in a little bit more of a kind of a recap / forward-thinking conversation with Brian Dohn, national recruiting analyst from 24/7 Sports. It feels like every single one of our podcast episodes lately, and I'm not even exaggerating, have led with our immediate reaction to either a commitment or a Penn State player target going elsewhere and our reaction to that. So instead, this time, we're going to get a chance to kind of catch our breath, look at what has gone right for the Nittany Lions, what's gone wrong, what could be next, and we'll get some perspective from the one and only Brian Dohn momentarily. After Brian, we'll have Daniel Gallen on, our Lions 24/7 colleague, to dive into the details of the video game grades for Penn State's 2024 roster. I know everybody is either playing this game or taking a break to listen to the podcast right now, it seems. So we'll talk about that very topical discussion in just a little while. But as I alluded to, Brian Dohn joins us here in the Lions 24/7 podcast. And I'll just put it out there for those of you who may be viewing us on YouTube. I have a different background than I normally ever do. We just moved into a new house on the other side of Happy Valley yesterday on Monday. So still trying to get the permanent studio set up here in our new place. But bear with me on that. I think we got a decent setup for now. Brian, welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. I know it's been a long summer so far.
Been a long summer. It's mid-July, but it feels like the heavy lifting when it comes to recruiting in the summer is so often now done before August, before preseason camps. And in Penn State's case, they certainly accomplished a lot in recent months. They went over the 20 commitment mark. They were at about a dozen commits on June 10th. But more recently, I think while people are getting excited about all the momentum, a little bit of a halt to that last week as Taz Williams came off the board out of Texas. Going to Baylor. It's something that Tyler Calvaruso and I discussed previewing that decision. Baylor made a late run. It involved NIL plans. Ultimately, they brought him on board after really an unorthodox commitment ceremony that took place over the weekend. And then, of course, Lex Cyrus came off the board last Thursday, going to South Carolina over Penn State. Those were his two finalists. And Brian, I want to start with Cyrus because you were as engaged and with that recruitment process as anybody in the industry. You had a story up after he announced his commitment to South Carolina on Thursday. And I think for a lot of people, as much as they may have wanted to see Taz Williams jump on board, highly productive Texas receiver, they're seeing a young man here at Susquehanna Township who made a couple trips up to campus in the summer, has been on the board for a year. They felt like the relationships may have been in the right place to get this one done. Instead, Penn State on the outside looking in as things stand in mid-July. Can you take us through the layers of the Lex Cyrus decision and maybe why we're still monitoring his recruitment moving forward?
Yeah, I think I'll start with the latter and on why you still monitor it, because he's been to campus a bunch of times and he's got a lot of people around him that think Penn State is still the best option. And it's very easy for him to get to campus in the fall if he wants to come to a game. So I think starting there for me is why it still remains interesting. And that's not to say that South Carolina did anything wrong or South Carolina is going to lose him. We don't know that. But especially right in the aftermath, he made the decision probably a few weeks ago, let it out publicly last week. And I think there were so many people around him, and I had spoken with his coach about this when I was out at Penn State at a 7-on-7 in late June. And he said, well, it seems like everybody around the kid wants him to go to Penn State. And so maybe he's thinking, hey, I need to do something on my own and go to South Carolina. And that's not to downplay how well South Carolina did with recruiting him. They did a great job with him. They have another Harrisburg kid on the roster and Tyshawn Russell, and so there were a lot of things that South Carolina did really well. Their receivers, Coach Fury is doing a really good job in connecting with some high-end talent and guys that maybe South Carolina would not have gotten in the past. And so I think those all played into it. It's just, let me tell you, you've been around too. When Penn State doesn't get a kid from Central Pennsylvania that they wanted, I think it resonates differently than even if it's a Philly kid or a Pittsburgh kid or a kid from New Jersey or Maryland. It's just different, but it also happens. I mean, it's part of recruiting. You're not getting every kid you want.
I mentioned Taz Williams, and I'm going to bring up an aspect of his recruitment that, Brian, we're all becoming more and more familiar with. Williams is a guy who put out a top 4 of Michigan, Penn State, Southern Methodist, and Texas A&M leading up to his commitment on Saturday. He ends up through a couple different hijinks in his announcement process, committing to Baylor. And it was kind of a poorly kept secret that Baylor was the team waiting in the wings because of what we had heard they may have brought to the table in the final few days. How much of this, does this typify where we are in recruiting? Not for everybody, but where you can spend months, maybe even a year building relationships. And because of the financial opportunities that can be presented in the 11th hour, a lot of that can get nullified.
It's more common than it had been in the past, but it's still not a common practice. I mean, Taz has a lot of connections in Pittsburgh, which is why Penn State was so heavily involved in the first place. But at the end of the day, it's a Texas kid staying home. And so you have to look at that. But yeah, I mean, it's part of a lot of the discussions. And I know there's a lot of fans that maybe don't want to hear that or maybe don't accept that yet. But NIL is part of every recruitment. But there's also the aspect of development, of long-term plans that also are big factors in it. And so that's why you see some other programs who maybe don't have the strongest NIL still getting some really good players. I think it's really easy to sit here and say, well, Baylor came in late and, gave him some NIL. And I think there was a quote I saw from his head coach speaking about, why you're doing well in recruiting. And it was, NIL was part of it. But, there's still a lot of kids out there who, while NIL is part of the discussion, it is not the end all be all. And I think what's happened is, Tyler, it used to be in the day when you didn't get a kid and it was a surprise. It was like, we didn't want him anyway. Who cares? Yeah. Well, now it's, NIL, that's why we lost them. And that's not the case in most because times. Brian, that's such a small percentage.
Brian, you mentioned that, and obviously we saw a lot of that on Saturday. And then my mind goes back, well, they just got one of the premier edge rushers in the country out of Texas a couple weeks ago, and that wasn't by accident.
Right. I mean, it still comes down to hard work, relationships, trust. The NIL stuff, from my understanding, it's not like these kids are committing and then signing right away for the NIL stuff. There's some other stuff that has to take place. And so there's still that trust that's built with the staff and familiarity. And, listen, I get it, these kids are young, but they have families who can also help mentor them and people close to them who can mentor them through the process. And you're not going to go to a program, if somebody's offering you a job and you think the place is a mess, you're not going to just go because they're offering some more money, because you're still looking at your future. So there's a lot of other factors that are in play in this. It's just convenient and easy to say, oh, it's NIL. And I try to shy away from that, because I think that is, at least from my standpoint, I think that's a lazy way to approach things. Now, is it accurate in some instances? Without question. But on a whole, no, because when NIL is involved, by the time you get to a top 4, top 5, it's usually all NIL schools or not all. You know what I mean? I mean, it's not like all of a sudden it's like, okay, here's my 5 schools. And then you wake up 3 days before your announcement and be like, geez, I think maybe I should do NIL and go to the highest bidder. That's not how it works.
Brian, you noted something about NIL that I think people are starting to take note of, but maybe don't fully understand the impact, is the ability for families to be at games and be present on campuses that are way beyond their hometowns, where in the past that was a financial burden for families. Now there's NIL avenues to get mom, dad, sister, brother, aunt, uncle, grandma, grandpa, whoever in Beaver Stadium, in town for a weekend in September or October. How has that helped Penn State maybe recruit more nationally? And conversely, how does it complicate things when Penn State's trying to sell the stay home so everyone can see you play pitch?
Yeah, I think the stay home and see everyone, it's not everyone can see you play pitch. It's more hey, you can hang out with your family and friends after games or for the weekend. And, I didn't understand a lot of this until my kid went away to school and play sports. And, it's different when the game ends, win or lose, and he can come over and spend 15, 20 minutes, even if he's getting on a bus after that, compared to some of the other kids whose families maybe aren't on trips and stuff. So I think it's that aspect of it that's important that schools really sell. I mean, they can see you play. I mean, shoot, man, you can watch a game from who knows where on your phone at any time now. So it's not just about can you see it? It's experiencing it. But what you bring up with NIL is, instead of, let's just say in the past, schools were able to be creative in getting families to games, where now it's just out front where you can just, hey, part of your gig is you're going to have either the finances, or we have this kind of, our collective has this agreement with an airline or a hotel chain that, we're going to get you 2 people coming in or 4 people coming in for each game, and here's where you're staying. And so it makes it a lot less cumbersome for families to deal with because it's kind of already set up for them. Now, listen, as somebody who's lived on both coasts, it still doesn't make it easy to be like, hey, I think I'm going to go to LA for the weekend. Or when I lived in LA, I think I'm going to go to New Jersey for 3 days. It's still exhausting and tiring, and you still have to travel. It just makes it easier. And you're really talking about, 10, 11 weekends out of the year anyway. It's not like an every weekend deal.
While we're on the subject of in-state targets for Penn State, a lot has been made of, based on our rankings, going over the top 8 as of now in Pennsylvania rankings. Now, there's layers to this, and you wrote a piece on Monday at lions247.com. So take us below the surface a little bit, where people can work their way through that list and make the kind of conclusions they want in the 2025 cycle. Penn State, keeping top talent home, pursuing top talent. Where do things stand right now as we work our way through the summer of 2024?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, right now, like you said, in the 247 rankings, they don't have any of the top 8. But like you said, there's layers. I mean, there's a couple of them that they didn't recruit. Simple as that. It's been documented well enough that, they struggle recruiting St. Joe's Prep, which just happens to have, 3 of them. So you're now down to 5. And one's a tight end who goes to Michigan. He talked about early playing time, and Andrew Olish. And you look at Penn State's tight end room, and you sit there and you say, well, it's a pretty good tight end room with or without Andrew Olish. The quarterback, Matt Zollers, who went to Missouri, Penn State already had a quarterback committed. They were going to take 2. And, Missouri is doing a really good job recruiting. And we mentioned NIL and being able to travel to games, and it's a lot easier for Zollers and his family to go see him play in the SEC. So it's simple to sit here and say, and it's the reason I wrote the story, Tyler. It's simple to sit here and say, well, geez, Penn State hasn't gotten any of the top 8. What's wrong? But you have to look at the circumstances of it. First of all, how many did they want? And second, if you go back and look at the top 8, going back to, I think, 2010, they only got more than 4 once. And there were a lot of Central PA kids sometimes, which is better for them, or Pittsburgh kids. It's just one of the things that drives me nuts, not only in this business, but in this world, is when we always want to paint everything with a broad brush. Oh, Penn State just lost a heartbreaker at home. That's going to kill recruiting. No, it's not. Oh, they won this big game on their road. Now we're going to get all these kids. No, you're not. That's not how it works. And you can't just sit here and paint and use a paintbrush and say, hey, they didn't get all 8. Here's why. There are so many different circumstances involved in it. It doesn't matter. You talked about staying home. There's kids that want to get out of their situations at home, and they want to get far away, and they want to experience life, and they want to get out on their own. And it's not just Penn State. This goes on in every state. And so they want to leave the state. Well, James Franklin's a really good recruiter, and so are a lot of his assistant coaches. But it's really hard to change the mind of a 17, 18-year-old when they have had this philosophy and this mindset for 3 or 4 years. Because, yeah, you can go to Penn State and play in a top 10 program, but if you're a top 10 program at Penn State, that means there's 9 others that are top 10 programs too that probably fit a lot of your criteria. And if you want to get away from home, it's it makes it tough. And so I don't think you can just sit here and go, oh, geez. Not to mention, we mentioned Cyrus, we mentioned Olish. It's a long way between now and that first Wednesday in December when signing day rolls around. So, I would not be surprised if either of them showed up at a Penn State game in the fall.
2 big-time pass targets. Penn State was heavily involved in there. Mike Carroll is a legacy that we've talked about quite a bit on this show. He's committed to Alabama, an offensive lineman. When it comes to flip season, Zahir Mathis is a guy that you reported on several weeks ago. He popped up on campus for an official visit with Penn State. We know that there's been engagement there. When you talk about some of the guys who are on that list showing up committed elsewhere, do you think there is a very real opportunity for Penn State, specifically with the strong start to the season, maybe some offensive fireworks with the new coordinator, to really get themselves back in the game for a full circle kind of recruitment process come December?
Yeah, I think there is, because, we're talking about in-state kids who are going to see and hear about Penn State a lot, right? I mean, they're going to go to school and people are going to be talking about it, whether it's good or bad. Right. And so from that standpoint, yeah, it makes sense. And again, one of the things I'm working on for the long term is, decommitments and why they happen. And just one of the trends, there's a lot of different factors is, location. And there's a lot fewer times a kid will decommit from the local school to go somewhere, unless you're talking about like a lower power 4 going to a blue blood. I mean, that'll happen. But when you're talking about high level kids, they don't usually decommit from their in-state school to go out of state. And so, yeah, it's definitely stuff worth charting. I wouldn't have written it or brought it up if I didn't think there was credence to it.
Yeah, and I recall Tysier Denmark spending much of the 2024 cycle committed to the Oregon Ducks before he ultimately decided to stay in his home state. Now he's a freshman here in Happy Valley. Going back to the receiver recruiting conversation, that's kind of been a point of consternation among Penn State fans. Obviously, it's exacerbated by what the on-field product looked like last fall, and there is a lot of hope that in year 2, Marcus Hagan's bunch can look better on the field. But in terms of building toward the future, they bring in this 3-man class that we've discussed, you and I, on this podcast, and Josiah Brown, Tysier Denmark, and Peter Gonzalez. But looking toward the future, Lyric Samuel was a solo act for a while in this receiving class. They go down and get Jeff Exeter Jr. from the McDonough School a couple weeks ago. And then I think there was some hope that they would kind of complete this class and double it by bringing in Taz Williams and Lex Cyrus. They strike out on both of those occasions. They're still at a 2-man group. We'll get to another guy they're involved in, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on Marcus Hagan's now. It's his first really full-on recruiting cycle where he's been able to build some roots with guy wearing the Penn State logo on his shirt. So where can it go from here? How can it get better? And do you think it's something to worry about, or is this just really tied to people being frustrated about the 2023 season?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all of it. I think if you sit there and ask people, at Penn State and in the Lash building, they're going to be disappointed that they didn't get Lex Cyrus, right? There's going to be disappointment there. I think it's something that you have to look at. I remember watching Penn State last year on the field with receivers and was like, man, who scares you here? Like, who scares you as a receiver? And you for me, I didn't really have that guy, just in watching them. And so the room needed work. There's a reason they went and got Julian Fleming. The room needed work. Fleming was at Ohio State and was kind of like a role player at Ohio State. It's not a quick build. It's in one vein, you'd like to see them land some of these kids, especially, like I said, Lex Cyrus, or get involved with some because you made a change at receivers coach with Marcus Hagans. Now, you did bring in I love Lyric Samuel. I've known him since his freshman year. I think he's got a huge upside now. It's going to take a while to get there because he's got to get stronger and, work on a lot of technique with route running and stuff. Jeff Exenor, I've seen play in camp and all that stuff. And I think he's a kid that can come in and play early. As long as you pick up the playbook, he can play early in his career. Physically, he'll be ready too. But you also have to consider when Penn State goes on the road to recruit, what are they using to recruit? Well, yeah, they have Jahan Dotson and they've had some good receivers, but they're showing an offense that struggles to get down the field to get chunk plays. And the schools they're trying to recruit against, that's really hard to combat. Like we talked about Taz Williams with Baylor. I don't know how many people watch the Big 12, but I mean, it seems like every other play is like a 45-yard pass. You know what I mean? I mean, those are big plays after big plays in a league that is kind of wide open on offense, at least from what I've watched, and I've watched my share of the Big 12. And so it's not just is Marcus Hagans building the relationships. It's when he's building them, what does he have to go to sell, and who is he competing against in terms of being able to sell that vision, make them believe it. But on the flip side, that's his job. He's hired to coach. He's hired to get really good receivers in. So I think it's something that you keep an eye on and you see, and you wonder with the new OC, Andy Koltanecki, who I watched a ton at Kansas, who is really good at spreading out defenses, finding that one-on-one matchup, letting some receivers excel in one-on-one coverage. But you got to show it. And like you mentioned before, if Penn State all of a sudden is like this juggernaut tossing the ball all over the yard, people are going to pay a lot more attention to it. I mean, it's like, how many times did I hear going through recruiting after Micah Parsons? Oh yeah, they're recruiting me to, be the next Micah Parsons. Okay. I mean, good luck with that. But I mean, that's how a lot of kids and their families think this way, is like, we're not in the age anymore to rebuild. Kids don't want to, the stars don't want to go rebuild programs. They want to go to established places. And I think you see receivers on a whole are looking for places, not, oh, here's how I can make the offense better. It's what will it be like as soon as I get there? And so I think there's a lot. I think it's a complex issue. But it's definitely, I mean, you'd like to see them. The Lex Cyrus one was big, and so we'll see how it plays out.
One name that's out there right now has not determined his college football pick, Kobe Howard at the receiver spot. It's a name that has come up here in the podcast. It's a name that feels like has more importance to it now, considering the circumstances of recent days on that receiver board. High 3-star in our rankings at 24/7 Sports. Industry composite puts him in 4-star territory at a Chaminade Madonna Prep in South Florida. And Brian, you've caught up with him a couple times through this process. He made an official visit up to campus in June and now planning a return trip. Can you work us through what remains to be done before he's ready to announce a decision?
Yeah, I think for the most part, it's, does he come to Penn State, not only go to the Lash Bash, but work out? And is Penn State happy with his workout? Do they think he's fast enough? Does he get out of breaks? I think that's a big thing to pay attention to with the visit. And I think a determination can be made after that. And then, they'll probably go back and revisit with Zaire Smith. He's an athlete who was committed to Alabama, decommitted, is, close with Maryland, made a lot of Maryland visits. He's from North Carolina High School down in Ridgely, Maryland. I could see them trying to get involved with him. He's a kid that has great speed, very similar to Lex Cyrus as a player. On the offensive side. So I think, the other thing, Tyler, is, as we talk about these guys, it's not like there aren't good players out there. They just got to find them. Go dig a little bit more and find them. They cast a very wide net with receiver recruiting. They offered more than 80 receivers, but that's their style of doing it. But we have a whole football season to play still on the high school level. There's going to be really good receivers. Maybe they're not committed. Maybe they missed their junior season. Maybe they're committed to group of 5 schools. They're out there. You just have to find them, recruit them, and try to bring them in.
Let's go into your wheelhouse right now, Brian. The Garden State, one of the top players in New Jersey for this cycle is Malachi Goodman, offensive lineman from Paramus Catholic, well inside the top 24/7. He's number 127 overall in those rankings, and Penn State is on the short list of contenders that are still in play for him. What remains to be done with Malachi Goodman, and where do you see Penn State standing at this stage?
I mean, he's got to sit down and decide it's decision time. I mean, that's what it comes down to be honest with you. He hasn't got there. He's a very low stress kid. He doesn't get bogged down by the process. He doesn't field calls from schools all the time. He does it on his own time frame. He's good enough to wait as long as he wants. When I was with him at his school, probably late June, early July. It all runs together, Tyler. But it was Penn State and Auburn were 2 that were really standing out to him. I could see him maybe going to USC. They were also involved, Georgia, Alabama. And it's just a matter of, and I think for me, I still think it's Auburn, Penn State. At the time I was with them, I kind of leaned a little bit toward Penn State. I think USC could get some momentum. I remember talking to him about the distance, and he's like, with NIL, it doesn't matter because they can get my family out there. So what we talked about earlier. But yeah, I think it's just, when does he decide to sit down and make a decision? That's it. And when does it become important to him? Now, I checked with him and his coach both within the last 2 days, and both said no time frame, no hurry, not really stressed about it. He does not think he'll make any more visits in the fall, but who knows? He's really has done a good job in remaining even keel and not getting stressed about making a situation.
Good for him. I mean, not putting that stress on himself to come up with a commitment date because everyone else is doing it this time of year. If he's got to.
When you're that good, when you're that good and that much of a commodity, you can afford to do that.
Absolutely. And Brian, I want to finish in talking about specific uncommitted prospects in the trenches on the defensive side of the football. A couple I want to get to who are still out there. But before we do, the man who is spearheading those recruiting efforts right now for Penn State, Deion Barnes, he was the subject of a profile piece you wrote last week. It featured commentary from him, from James Franklin, about his rise very quickly here in Happy Valley. Let's all remember that John Scott Jr. left like right before spring ball in 2023 to go off for an NFL job. And Deion Barnes really kind of wowed the rest of the staff. Manny Diaz, James Franklin to take over as the position coach. So this is year 2 in his role on the field, but this is really, again, his first full cycle to go out there and flex, build relationships. What is that feedback, and what was your conversation from Deion like? Because I know he's a guy that you probably don't have to squint too far in the rearview mirror to remember when he was going through the recruiting process himself out of Philadelphia.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things stood out. First, speaking with Coach Franklin, just how, Deion's had success recruiting. And Coach Franklin wasn't surprised because he watched it. I mean, John Scott was the D-line coach, but I remember, and I was talking to James about this when we spoke, and I just remember when going through the process, when I would talk to recruits, especially D-linemen, they talked about Deion Barnes a lot. And, when I'd ask about John Scott, he would come up and when they'd talk about him in the relationship. But the guy they really spoke to a lot and identified with was Deion Barnes. And so, and Tyler, and just you talk to Deion, you've known him for a while. He's easy to talk to. He's the kind of guy you talk to. You kind of feel like you've known him for a long time, even if it's your first time meeting him. He's very driven. He's very passionate. He's focused on bettering the kid, not just the player. And it comes across as genuine. And I think when He told me something really interesting. He said when he went for his interview with James, he said, I didn't have notes. I didn't sit there and start looking at all these lists. It was all passion. It was everything I believed in. I knew everything I believed in because I don't have to think about it. It's how I do things. And it really came across well in the interview. And you can sit there and say, hey, the interview, really blew James Franklin away. And it did. But if you didn't have a track record of being able to recruit in a different position, if we're not naive, we know even if you're not supposed to coach, but it doesn't mean you can't have discussions off the field, that technique. He has some NFL in him from his time with the Jets. He's an in-state kid who really, he grew up in a tough neighborhood, as he said, got through that, excelled at Penn State. I believe James told me he also has a master's degree. There's just so many things that you put Deion in front of not only a prospect, but a family and mom and dad who, they're happy that their kid's really good at football, but they want to know what their kid's going to be doing at 40 when football's over. And Deion can sit there and say, well, not only did I do this in football, but here's my academic success. It makes a lot of sense. And you don't have to teach Deion what's important about Penn State or, what are some of the flaws of Penn State. And I know, folks, there's not many, but I'm sure there's one or two. But you don't have to. He knows it. He lived it. He lived it as a player. He lived it as a guy on staff. And James also knows Deion's work ethic because he coached him for a year. So he knows, is this kid trying to get away with stuff? Does he put forth the effort? Is he a good guy in the locker room? And so when you have all that data, listen, James put it great when he said, in any situation, the ideal thing is to promote from within, because not only do you know what you're getting and you already know the person, but it can energize other people in the building. It just made complete sense on so many levels. Now, to combat it, we talk about some of these guys. You see, here, Mathis, you brought up. You have Larry Johnson. He's committed to Ohio State. Larry Johnson's the D-line coach there. So he's got decades of experience. And you have Deion, who has 1 year of on-field experience. And so you have to combat that. But on the flip side, if you're recruiting against Larry Johnson, everybody's sitting there saying, well, how long is he going to recruit for? So you're always looking for like the sweet spot on things. And for both of them, they're, Larry Johnson's experience here, how much longer does he coach? And Deion's here, doesn't have a lot of experience, but he's going to coach a long time. Nothing, very few things in life are perfect. So you go with what's best. And I think Deion was the best option, and he's proven that it was a good choice.
I've got to say that 1 year on his resume looks pretty good, leading the nation in tackles for loss and sacks, getting a first-round pick and a third-round pick on the defensive end spot.
It is, and I sit there and I listen, and they sell it to kids, and they talk about it, and the kids love it, and I get it. And I listen with Ohio State that, well, the Bosa's were first-round picks, and I'm like, all right, but I mean,
You knew they were going to be a first-round pick when they were 16, right?
I mean, Chop Robinson – was he going to be an undrafted free agent going into last year? You know what I mean? I mean, yeah, but you want to be able to show that at a high level you can develop. Can you develop that unbelievable talent into a first rounder and make sure he's there? And can you take the undrafted free agent and develop him to a mid-round draft pick? Adisa Isaac, we thought Adisa was going to be a stud. I mean, look at what his ranking was. And so you just want to make sure you're taking the talent and progressing them as a player. And I think after 1 year with Deion that you say, yes, yeah, that's exactly what you're doing.
Let's discuss a couple more names, Brian, that he'd like to get a chance to work with in the coming years. Potentially, Ivan Kamaju down at Paint Branch High School in Maryland. Been a name we've discussed on the defensive line board for a while. We'll get to another after him down in Florida. But when it comes to Kamaju, what do Nittany Lions fans need to know about? I think it's been a little while since we really got into his recruitment on this podcast.
I mean, it's still the same. It's Virginia Tech, Duke, Rutgers, Penn State. He is a big-time student. And when I say big-time student, I mean, like if this dude wanted to go to Yale, he could go to Yale. Big-time student. 4.7 GPA. Wants to be an engineer. So, he's looking at engineering programs and what they can do for you, which, Virginia Tech has a pretty good one. And there's not a lot of football players that can do the engineering major. I'm comfortable and confident that he has the mental acumen to be able to do it. And so now he's just sitting there waiting, kind of sorting through things. And I think it's a little bit like Malachi Goodman, where, look, he knows every school will take him. And so he's in no hurry to decide. Wants to decide before the start of his senior season. But in Maryland, that's kind of like late August. And so he has plenty of time just to sit there and wait and make a decision. And so with, Penn State keeps pushing for him. He's a really tough kid to read. There's been a lot of trade winds blowing toward Virginia Tech's way. It's mostly because of the engineering program. But, all these, Duke, Rutgers, Tech, Penn State, they'll all suit his academic needs, I think. Mm-hmm. And so it's just where he feels comfortable. He's just not ready to make the decision yet.
The other name I teased before, Jarquez Carter, he does have a decision date on the calendar, July 18th. So we're coming up toward it. It's this Thursday. You've had a couple catch-up conversations with him during recent weeks, and Penn State's been part of that conversation. What do we need to know as we get to the end of the finish line there?
Well, first of all, he's announcing with 247 Sports on the YouTube channel at 5 o'clock on Thursday. So we got that for you. But what do you need to know? I mean, I know he's listed in Florida in his top 5 as well, but it's Miami, Central Florida, Penn State, and Ohio State. Those are the ones. And he absolutely loved his Penn State visit. I mean, he raved about it. His family loved it. He liked it so much that he called me at midnight after he got home on the Sunday night after the visit, which, these kids ain't getting a lot of sleep on those visits. And so for him to have the energy and want to discuss Penn State, I thought was, told you what he thought of the visit. Ohio State, he made a midweek visit. It got scheduled late. So I think that's something to really keep an eye on. And Miami, look, they've made getting kids in Florida a priority, especially on the line of scrimmage. They made a great push for him. That was the last school he visited at the end of June. And I know he and I are going to speak on Wednesday night and kind of get a temperature there. But, as I sit here now, I think it's a Miami-Ohio State battle. But listen, Tyler, it's not saying it won't be Penn State. I'm not saying that, because as we've seen with Penn State in the last week and a half, there are some changes that go on when you're not expecting it. But, I think also a thing that's important to mention in all this stuff is sometimes kids come on visits and maybe they're not takes at schools. We're not talking Jarquez Carter here, but it serves its purpose. Well, these kids may be in the portal in 2 years. They may have developed, or maybe they went to a program and it didn't work out. So if Penn State, if Miami, if Central Florida, if Florida do not get Jarquez Carter, or Ohio State does not get Jarquez Carter now, it's changed. So you're also laying the groundwork in case something happens in the future. And like I said, this isn't about Jarquez Carter. This is about recruiting in general, but it's something to keep in mind with all these kids we talk about.
If Carter were to pick Penn State, that would be 4 pledges from the state of Florida in this Penn State class. That includes Beckham Kritza, who's kind of been a nomad of sorts, but he's now down in South Florida at Miami Central. But, Brian, that brings me to the final point and kind of the final thing I'll throw your way here before we say goodbye. Yeah. You look at the national landscape, and we spent some time talking about the in-state landscape, but the top 3 members of this class based on 24/7 Sports rankings are a cornerback from Southern California and Darius Dixon, an edge rusher from Kansas in Jaden Woods, and an edge rusher from Texas in Max Granville. All three of them drew crowds from across different conferences to their recruitment for multiple years. What do you make of that? Because that's not necessarily something we are accustomed to seeing, the very different non-regional flavor. And I'll also add bringing on board top 24/7 quarterback Troy Hune out of California for the 2026 cycle a few weeks back too.
Yeah, I think it's what we spoke about earlier, just in terms of because of NIL and the ability to get kids to different places and their families, it opens up other avenues. Now, the other thing is I'm wondering about this. I'm not ready to say it's a trend or it's heading that way, but I'm starting to see some stuff that makes me wonder, okay, have the Big Ten and SEC separated themselves from the Big 12 and the ACC when it comes to recruiting? And because I'm seeing some guys that are going to some schools that be like, boy, I wouldn't expect him to be at that Big Ten school instead of the local ACC school or one of the local ACC schools. And I think, again, we talk about each kid being different. Well, if I'm a DB going to Penn State, I'm giving them a pretty good look because they recruit some pretty good, they produce them, put them in the NFL, and it's something to really pay attention to. But it speaks to, listen, Penn State's probably got a lot of exposure, or I should say not a lot, but more exposure in Los Angeles and in California in general recently because of the changes with the Pac-12 and the 4 schools coming into the Big Ten. Going down and wanting to play on the line of scrimmage, if you're Granville, you want to play on the line of scrimmage in the Big Ten, which is a very physical league, then it makes sense. And it also speaks to, listen, just because you're not getting maybe the kid you want in state, they exist somewhere else. The same type of player exists somewhere else. So it's not like the end all be all. If you don't get, now it's just easier to keep them committed. It's easier to get them. There's less resources. It's not as time consuming to recruit, but there's good players all over. And so I give Penn State a lot of credit for going out and, they went to Kansas to get a really good player. I don't know the last time Penn State was in Kansas to get a kid. Maybe it was last cycle or 2 cycles ago. I don't know. But when I think of the Penn State footprint for recruiting, Kansas isn't really jumping out to me. And so whatever they're doing there, they're making it so these kids and their families are saying, yeah, okay, it's comfortable. That's where we want to go. And it makes sense.
Brian Dohn, one of the best in the business. We're fortunate to have him here at 24/7 Sports and here on the Lions 24/7 podcast, occasionally national recruiting analyst with 24/7 Sports. He is 2 days away from helping us usher in this Jarquez Carter commitment announcement at 24/7 Sports. He is 3 days away from a long overdue vacation. So, Brian, thanks for making us a part of your to-do list on your last week before that trip, and I hope you can really shut down, relax, and enjoy yourself.
I appreciate it, Tyler. Thank you.
All right, see ya. Let's go over to Daniel Gallen now, my colleague at Lions247.com. Daniel, welcome on board. Always a tough act to follow when Brian Dohn breaks down recruiting for us for 40-plus minutes. But as he's getting ready to work his way toward vacation, you're coming off of one. We hope you had a great time. Well-deserved. You were in the desert in the Southwest. You were up in the Great Lakes. I'm glad you were out and about. Good to have you back on board, though, man.
Yeah, definitely. If anyone wants any tips on unreasonable travel itineraries, I can help you out. It was a busy couple of weeks, but it's fun to be back. Good time to be back. And after being gone for a while, I was keeping track of what was going on. But listening to Brian was a good way to kind of reset, jump back in, and get back on the same page with what's going on with Penn State.
Yeah, you and I don't have much time before we are on full speed back in everything, because we're about 2 weeks away from getting over to Beaver Stadium for preseason media day and getting a chance to see practice with this team for the first time since spring ball. So a lot coming our way. But as everyone in the college football universe knows, this week is about video games. And you have a hard job here at 24/7 Sports, Daniel. We take you right off your vacation and say, write about video games, play video games, give us your analysis. And considering one of the people talking on this podcast hasn't owned a console since their freshman year of college, we're going to be leaning heavily on you and for what you were able to see. You've done some gameplay with Penn State so far. We're going to work our way through the roster. Of course, the game I'm talking about, if anyone has been living underneath a rock lately, is EA Sports College Football 25. A decade in the making. It is back. I think it's fully available globally on Friday, but I guess people who pay a little extra get to jump on board around, and you're part of that group. So, Daniel, first impressions of just having the controller, seeing Penn State's current players there, and being able to control their every move.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that the first thing I noticed is that it feels really real. Over the past week, you saw the people who had review copies. I know that a lot of kind of creators had early access. That EA Sports did a really nice job of kind of rolling this out, and really building the buzz for it. But the one thing that I kept seeing over and over and over again was people being like, the detail is really awesome, that they put a lot of time into it. And you fire up a game at Beaver Stadium with Penn State, and you have the Nittany Lion at midfield, pumping up the crowd. I played a game at Oregon on Monday night. You've got the duck riding the motorcycle out. You've got all these little things, all these little different traditions that EA Sports really kind of dialed in. And then the one thing too that really stood out to me is that I've been on the Penn State beat for 3 years. I think I've been to every home game at Beaver Stadium except for one, the 9 overtime game in 2021. Over these past 3 years, and you kind of get used to kind of the beats of a game day, kind of what you hear at certain times, what's going on, and kind of the interstitial moments. And I kind of got that feeling, playing the game, being in the menu, choosing my play and kind of hearing what was going on in the background. It sounded like a Beaver Stadium game day. So I thought that was really cool, just as kind of a first instinct, first kind of look at things. You mentioned that you haven't had a console since you were in college. I mean, I was still playing NCAA 09 on PS2 as of like summer 2022. So this is new to me. I'm still dialing in the gameplay. The passing's a little bit harder. They've made the games so thorough now that you can do all these different adjustments. A little bit different now than when I first played Madden 2002. But we'll see. But Penn State is a fun play, and I'm sure that a lot of Penn State fans have already given it a go a couple times.
Yeah, I think, and this was way before Penn State was on my radar for much, but when I had that video game, I remember playing with the Michael Johnson led Penn State offensive attack. That was usually my go-to. It was a lot of
Michael Robinson.
Michael Robinson. I'm sorry. Yeah, Michael Robinson. Did I say Michael Johnson? Yeah. No, they didn't make the video game when he was on campus for a year. Yeah, Michael Robinson. But anyways, that's about all I remember from doing that. So let's focus in on this 25 version. Obviously, it's not a complete thing because not everybody is on the roster. You saw Jalen Reed, who's one of the standout players for Penn State's defense, tweeting out pretty funny over the weekend. I guess he just didn't give his confirmation or whatever to be in the game and get his little payback that all these players have gotten across the league. And so you're going to have to wait to the update to get some guys. I know there's some freshmen missing, most notably Quentin Martin, a guy that we're all pretty excited about, first-year running back. But, Daniel, I thought we could just really begin with the 10 names who are at the top of these ratings, according to EA Sports. And I am not doubting the diligence they put into this. Still, as beat reporters who are invested locally on a day-to-day basis with the development of this roster, I think we'll probably have some opinions to offer up along the way in this conversation. But just going through the top 10 here, the top 3 are 91s overall with ratings. Abdul Carter, KJ Winston, Nick Singleton. We knew about this because they were featured in those top 100 player ratings that EA Sports put out last week. And I believe Carter was number 47 across the country. Winston was 57 and Singleton was 61. And then working your way, the only guy that cracks 90 is Tyler Warren at the tight end position. He is a 90. Drew Aller at 88. Katron Allen at 87. Defensive end denied Dennis Sutton is an 85. Right guard Sal Wormley in 84. He leads all offensive linemen. Middle linebacker Kobe King is also in 84. And then rounding out our top 10 here at the receiver position is Ohio State transfer Julian Fleming. So we'll go position by position as we go. But what did you make of that being the cluster of what is considered to be, I guess, the elite collection of talent on Penn State's roster as they prepare for kickoff?
Yeah, I think it tracks. I think that if you talk about a guy like Dennis Sutton, I think that, if you were to do these ratings at the end of the year, he's someone who would probably be a little bit higher. I think he's going to have a really big year, but everyone else kind of fell in about where I thought. Tyler Warren is the third best tight end in the game, which I think that if you've seen him play, kind of goes with it. And
dude, I've seen him missing from like preseason 3-team All Big Ten lists. So it's nice to see someone's been paying attention to what they have in number 44.
Yeah, and I will say that playing as him in the game was a ton of fun. Just like a a total tank. And I was texting with some people earlier about this today, and that for whatever reason, the vertical passing game is pretty tough to really lock in. The safeties have had some success against me, but if you're just running underneath or running things more horizontally instead of vertically, Tyler Warren is a good target. Usually hauls it in. But with the rest of this
you've
list,
been having some trouble chucking it deep.
Yeah, just a tiny bit.
Okay.
But no, I mean, I think the one name that maybe surprised me a little bit was Sal Wormley. I think that it's mostly just he's more under the radar. I think that when you talk about the position battles on this roster, he's not necessarily involved in a one-to-one position battle. And then in the spring, we saw a lot of Cooper Cousins at right guard. So it was maybe a little easier to forget about Sal Wormley, but he's someone who's played a lot of football, veteran presence, is a sixth-year senior. And he's someone who, Penn State, I think that you go back to 2021 and not having him, they really kind of chalk that up as something that really hurt them on an offensive line that struggled for much of that season. And then, going through just outside the top 10, you got Tony Rojas, Cam Miller, AJ Harris, and Jalen Kimber at 82 and 81. And I thought we'll get to the position by position, but I thought that those were that kind of tracked as well. But yeah, I mean, you look at this top 10, I think that it made sense to me. There's been nothing. We'll get to some that maybe made me raise my eyebrows, but in that top 10, I was kind of like, oh, okay, let's go. This makes sense for Penn State.
Quick comment. It's not going to be the top 10 in a couple of weeks when this update comes out, because unless they made a mistake, I think Jalen Reed probably needs to be among this group. I mean, based on what he did last year, I know he wasn't an All Big Ten selection. I think he certainly can be this year. He's going to play that lion role we expect. A lot of his season's going to come at the second level, but so he's not in this game yet. Just to hammer that home, if you're looking for him while you're playing and you're like, why is Dakari Nelson starting or something like that? This is the situation. So I think when Jalen Reed, I don't know if he's going to be. I maybe think he slots between Katron Allen and Dennis Sutton. I think Dennis Sutton, none of us really view him as an 85, but you can understand with 3 starts under his belt why he's an 85. And Katron Allen, to me, in this top 10 list, he's the guy that I say, man, a 4-point gap between him and Nick Singleton is not really lining up with what we've witnessed from their careers through 26 games. And you made the point, because I was texting you about this, and I said, wow, that doesn't seem exactly right. You said that the fact that Singleton has really extraordinary acceleration maybe is a separating factor in a game like this versus Katron Allen's style of play. But to me, what Katron Allen has been really from game 1 through game 26, he's averaged 5.2 yards per carry each of his first 2 seasons. I was a little surprised that he wasn't a little higher, or that maybe him and Nick Singleton, one way or the other, weren't a little bit closer. I'm sure it will serve as some kind of motivating factor. As we already saw Dennis Sutton tweet out, he didn't approve his rating. I don't think we'll see Katron Allen tweet things out. And he has said all the right things about his relationship with Nick Singleton, and they have swapped starts and they've swapped touchdowns and they swapped accolades. But I'd imagine this was noted among Katron Allen and his inner circle, that there was a bit of a gap between him and his co-starter in these ratings.
Definitely. And I think the one thing that you talk about, the realism in games, one thing that it's kind of hard to pin down is, actually doing some of the rotations that you see, happen in game. You're not going to be like, oh, it's the second quarter, I'm going to go to the menu and change the depth chart to put Katron Allen in as the number 1 running back. Those things aren't necessarily top of mind in the playbook. which we can talk about a little bit more. That there are a couple 2 running back sets, so you do get Allen and Singleton on the field at the same time. Another feature that is new to the game this year is wear and tear, where over the course of a game, if a player is making a lot of plays, getting a lot of carries, both sides of the ball, they'll pop up of what their injury risk is. And so you can kind of keep track of that. And so when I was playing with Penn State, it popped up a couple times with Singleton. So I went in, ran some plays for Allen, things like that. But I will say with just to round out the running back conversation, it is kind of, you mentioned not having Quentin Martin. Corey Smith isn't there either. So it's just Cam Wallace, as the only, real player. They have a couple
68. The buzz about Cam Wallace here in State College has not reached EA headquarters. And I understand he didn't play a single game. He was a 3-star recruit. But I think if you pass along that 68 number to anyone in team facilities right now, they'd laugh you out of the building because they feel like they've got something special brewing. But that's where it is in the running back room right now, according to EA Sports, because you're missing Quentin Martin from the equation and the newcomer, Corey Smith.
Cam Wallace is he's a 94 as a kick returner, though. So they do acknowledge the special team skills. But, there's a couple positions where you have CPU guys in a little bit more prominent roles as like rotational players. So that's something that I've done the couple of times I've played with Penn State is go into the depth chart right away and take those guys out of the equation. Like there's a cornerback, there's a tight end who have pretty decent ratings, which I don't really know what goes into that if they're really supposed to be placeholding for people. But the game developers can talk more about that. But running backs though. If you like to run the football, this is a good game to do it. I think the Penn State playbook has a lot of pistol. So it's fun to get Singleton or Allen a nice running start going into the offensive line.
And then I know that last time we saw Penn State trot out a starting lineup on the offensive side, it was 2 running backs involved out there down in Atlanta in the Peach Bowl, both Singleton and Allen, part of those first 11 involved on the field. Daniel, the one other thing I'll point to from the top 10 before we get to some just topical stuff from position rooms. Sal Wormley, you're right. That did catch my attention. I think if you polled a lot of people, whether it was on the beat or people who follow closely on our message board and said, rank the top 5 Penn State offensive linemen right now based on talent and just overall talent. And I know that I don't know if that's what EA Sports is going to come up with those ratings from. It's a combination of different metrics. But I don't think Sal Wormley would be right there for a lot of people. I think you'd say that what you're getting now to Sal Wormley. He's a guy that told us this year that he came back to play angrier, more aggressive, more physical. He thinks that's going to take this offensive line to the next level. He thinks it's going to take him to the next level in terms of his NFL evaluation as a 6-year player. But I also kind of think, well, among those 6-year players and how they've impacted games, and Sal Wormley was a mainstay last year. But I look over to the defensive tackle room and somebody that I just felt finished the 2023 season on fire the way they were playing, was really good in the Peach Bowl for the most part, is Devon J. Thomas, who we, of course, have for the last 5 years here called Devon Elise. Recently changed his name to Devon J. Thomas. He's an 80, and so that places him pretty well out of striking distance for this top 10. And Sal Wormley at an 84. And that's kind of one discrepancy where I'm pointing out and thinking guys who are, right there in the middle of these trenches, not to take anything away from Sal Wormley, but I'm thinking maybe there's a case for Devon J. Thomas to be part of this top 10 conversation or on the cusp of it. Because I just don't quite know if people understand, because there was a lot of attention on the offensive side of things and on the, the premier NFL draft prospects on the defensive side of the football late in the season. But Devon J. Thomas was playing lights out football and had really a lot of reasons to turn pro. And if he can extend that for a full season here as a 6-year guy, and we know the kind of presence he is, this is getting away from the EA ratings a little bit, but he's somebody to me that I think is maybe a little under the radar generally. And this kind of confirms it to me.
Yeah, when I talked to Deion Barnes last month of that availability, I kind of posited it to him that, we thought that was the best stretch of football that we've seen Devon play, and would he agree with that? And he did. He said that he thinks that was probably, the best, if not some of the best football that Devon has played at Penn State. And Deion Barnes talked about that. It's kind of now the next step is realizing what went into that and making sure that you're doing that every day and not really letting things up. Barnes said that he talked to Devon like that morning, and that was kind of the message to him. And so, I think that, I thought that the defensive tackle ratings were kind of accurate, not necessarily in, having Devon at an 80, maybe you could be a little higher, but in terms of the cluster, where it's Devon J. Thomas at an 80, Zane Durant at a 79, Keziah Izzard at a 77, no Hakeem Beamon, Alonzo Ford, Caleb Artis, or Ty Blanding, but all 4 freshmen are in there. Which
I gotta imagine these guys are getting dogged right now. I mean, if it's a situation like Jalen Reed where like I just straight up forgot to like submit the to give the thumbs up, to get my money, to get my free game, to get myself in a game, like if Beam, I gotta imagine there are some jokes being cracked in team facilities. And when these guys are gathering around and playing, and they've got like these CPU generated placeholders, there's got to be some good banter going on right now.
there is a defensive tackle who I think was like a 77 or 76 who was in there as a CPU. And so in your head, you can kind of be like, I guess that's Akeem Beamon. I don't know how much you can edit them. I haven't looked that much into the roster modifications, but I did think that kind of that cluster, because when we talk about that rotation, obviously Durant and Jay Thomas have solidified themselves as the top 2, I think, but we know that Deion Barnes likes to rotate. And we know that guys like Keziah Izzard and Hakeem Beamon have played a lot of football, had some success, and can do some things out there. So that was a position group that a lot of absences, but it stood out to me for how those guys were clustered together. And then I thought it was cool that you got the 4 early enrollee defensive tackles in there.
Let's bounce around the position rooms a little bit here. Over at quarterback, we talk about Drew Allar being an 88. That places him 13th best overall, tied for 13th best. And I'd imagine that if you talked about Drew Allar taking up the starting job last year, or even when he got to campus a couple years ago, and you said, where will Drew Allar be ranked when he's a junior, when this game finally comes out among quarterbacks, I think tied for 13th would be a little bit of an underwhelming result. But we know the ceiling that's in place for him. And I think maybe there's a question about the ceiling at quarterback that's in place for everyone else in that room. We know Bo Pribula has a tremendously high ceiling as an athlete. He could do a lot of things in the football field. And we heard Andy Kotelnicki say he's he can be a special weapon for the offense, but he's a 76. Ethan Grunkemeyer, true freshman, is actually ahead of a guy who's got a head start on him in Jackson Smolik. Grunkemeyer is 75, Smolik is 72. And let's remember, Smolik finished spring ball sideline. We got to keep track of his ability to play football after being injured earlier this year. But I think something that pops up there is if something were to happen with Allar and you need a second quarterback to be a steady presence playing quarterback, is Bo Pribula, can he be that guy? Or do you have to completely change? And by the way, Andy Kotelnicki did this last year. It's why he was 24/7 Sports Offensive Coordinator of the Year. You have to completely change your offensive approach because you have quarterback A versus quarterback B. And then the question beyond that is, can Grunkemeyer make his move this year, first year on campus, where he can get in a situation, and if Drew Allar were to move on after his junior year to the NFL, where it is very much a conversation about who replaces him involving a second-year Grunkemeyer next spring?
Yeah, I think that the quarterback room is pretty interesting. And, I think that in real life, there probably is a little bit more of a gap between Pribula and Grunkemeyer than one rating point,
I think
given how long Pribula's been on campus and everything they've said about him. But I do think that Grunkemeyer has an opportunity. It'll be interesting to see what kind of run he gets in the non-conference, those Bowling Green and Kent State games, because I believe Smolik only had 1 appearance last year, and that was
2 snaps. Pribula got like briefly bloody or something after a snap.
Yeah, and so I'm curious if Grunkemeyer, is able to get a little bit more run than that, because I think that at this point, Pribula is going to be a redshirt sophomore. He got a lot of experience last year. They're going to get him reps in those games, but does Grunkemeyer maybe get a couple more opportunities? I think that that's something that stands out to me. But virtually, I stuck with Allar the whole time. I was playing with Penn State. I didn't do any Pribula. The read option feature is a little counterintuitive to what it's been in the past, and I think what it is on Madden. So that's been a little bit difficult for me to get used to. So I haven't really done too much with mobile quarterbacks. But playing with Aller, the arm strength is real. I had my issues in the vertical passing game, but he can fit the ball into the windows. He can make some things happen, and I think that's a lot of fun.
Now, in terms of pass targets here, you're missing some guys. You're not playing with a full deck at tight end, that's for sure. You're not only are you missing Andrew Rapplier and Joey Schlafer, who are actually not only are you missing Andrew Rapplier, you're missing Joey Schlafer, is what I meant to say. Being both those guys came to the campus last year. Rapplier was kind of ready to play, and even more so here in year two. He's really the guy that we've put at front and center, battling Khalil Dinkins for the number 2 tight end job behind Tyler Warren. Can't play with him right now. Can't play with Schlafer, who looks like almost a completely different person physically, 30 plus pounds more than when he got to campus last year. And the next highest rating at tight end beyond Tyler Warren is the true freshman, Luke Reynolds, a 79. Dinkins and Jerry Cross, both at 78. I find it's interesting that a guy who has not shown up in any way on the field on Saturdays and Cross would have the same rating as a guy who, came through with some key moments last year and played a significant amount of snaps as a tight end 3, but that's where they are with the ratings. And then over at wide receiver, you don't have the freshman fanfare. You do have one and Josiah Brown, which I did note this. He's 1 point ahead of Tyler Johnson. Johnson's a 66 as a redshirt sophomore. Josiah Brown's a 67 as a true freshman who missed his senior year of high school with an injury. But you don't have Peter Gonzalez. You don't have Tysier Denmark. And at the end of the day, you've got 2 guys who get to that 80 point realm. You got Harrison Wallace right at 80, and he's one of those players you would circle on this and say, let's check back those ratings early November, on this game when they're updating them, because he has major potential if he's available. And then Fleming's an 83, scattered in the mix. Liam Clifford is 76. Caden Saunders is 74, Amari Evans is 73, Anthony Ivy is 72. Not an easy task to kind of apply ratings to these guys, considering what we haven't seen. I guess it's about right. I think the tight end room looks pretty clunky based on compared to where it really is. But at wide receiver, it's, kind of what we said. Julian Fleming has proven some stuff, but not really to the extent that he wanted to in Columbus. And Harris Wallace has proven some stuff here in State College, but not for an extended period of time. And then everybody else is just searching for roles that they can cling to and maybe thrive with.
Yeah, to touch on the wide receivers, in the game, I guess I didn't say what I did, but I played. Sorry, 1 second. I played as Penn State against Washington. 49. I won 49-17. And I did chuck it deep. I had a 59-yard completion to Harrison Wallace in that.
The whiteout game, by the way, we're just we'll mention that.
Yeah.
We're not going to spend a 5-minute segment. The whiteout game is the Washington matchup, November 9th. So Daniel already simulated it. It's going to be a fantastic day for everybody. We don't know what time the matchup will start, but Daniel has the results for us already.
Yeah, and so I was able to do some different things, and I tried out some different things. And once the game was out of hand, I tried to throw it deep to Trey Wallace, and it worked. Liam Clifford and Caden Saunders were fun little pieces to play with in kind of the intermediate. There's a lot of jet sweeps, a lot of jet action, which I think is fun in the game, and that's something where Caden Saunders excels. But yeah, I mean the wide receiver group, it is kind of what it is. We've talked about them enough this year, and that kind of carries over into the game a little bit. You did mention the tight end room being a little bit clunkier. I think I'd agree with that. Rapplier has posted that he'll be in the game eventually. He's in the same boat as Jalen Reed, where once there's an update, he should be in the game. This was also a spot where there was a CPU player who's the default number 3 tight end behind Warren and Dinkins, which is a little weird. Also, for some old school Penn State fans, there is a fullback spot on the roster. There is no fullback on the Penn State roster, but Khalil Dinkins defaults to the fullback. And the way that shows up in the game is when they're doing the two back sets, some of the two back sets in the pistol. Dinkins will be lined up back there next to Drew Aller. He's in the middle of the T, which is in the game.
We've seen that. I mean, we've actually seen that in the flesh. So that's in the game. Yeah. Exactly.
And so that's kind of how it shows up. But yeah, I mean, I was surprised to see Luke Reynolds rated that high, but I mean, 5-star recruit, Number one tight end in the country, someone that there's a lot of excitement about. I think that that's a very, very cool thing.
I got questions on the offensive line here, and this is not me like trying to spotlight a kid and saying he shouldn't be this rating, but Alex Birchmeier is a 79. That's 3 points higher than Chimdi Ono. That's 2 points higher than Nick Dawkins. That's 3 points higher than Cooper Cousins. It's the same rating as JB Nelson. What am I missing? I mean, Alex Birchmeier came to campus last year, didn't go into a game, and we really haven't heard much buzz about him being a real two-deep competitor. And I think he's like the 5th highest or 6th highest rated offensive lineman. Now, again, this isn't about Birchmeier. I just think we're missing something here because Cooper Cousins as a 76 and Nick Dawkins as a 77 comparatively confused me. And then Anthony Donko, someone who did come to campus, played pretty by far the most snaps among any offensive lineman by the end of this thing, almost 100 of them, and looked really strong. And I think it's just this is where it's different, I guess. There's a lot of what they're basing off of maybe recruitment. But, Birchmeier was a top 100 overall player coming to campus. And so I'm sure that they are, giving a lot of credence to recent recruiting rankings in these. Just was tricky for me. It kind of like nullified a lot of whatever else I saw. And just, what else we saw was Drew Shelton's an 81. Javen Williams is an 80 over at left tackle. Vega Ioane is an 80, which I think time will show that was very low for him. JB Nelson's a 79. Then you've got Sal Wormley as an 84, as we discussed. Nolan Rucci, who came in from Wisconsin, is an 80. And like I mentioned, Anthony Donko is 76. That's also the same rating as Chimdi Ono. So I don't know if the case I'm trying to make is that like Nick Dawkins, Cooper Cousins, and I get Cooper Cousins is a true freshman, but like Anthony Donko, something's missing. Something's lost in translation here. And Alex Birchmeier is a 79 and those guys. So I have a hard time even really having a conversation here other than me saying I'm confused.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is probably one of those areas that you talk about where it's like we're probably like too close to this.
We are in the weeds. Oh
yeah. I mean, we're talking about the number 2 right guard. That how many people in the country have really heard of. When people are going through the game, I don't think most people outside of Penn State fans are gonna see that and take note of it. So I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that the rankings, the ratings that people, I guess they try to make them as close as they can, and nothing is ever going to be 100% realistic. And for me, I think one of the ways that I've approached this is I like the realism. I like to kind of know what I'm in for, but at the same time, like I want to have fun with it. So I saw like there's some consternation about Shadur Sanders being the top ranked quarterback in the game, and I was just kind of like, okay. I mean, that makes for a more fun game. Maybe it's not as realistic, but for me, like the idea of watching Colorado last year, a lot of times that was fun. You kind of didn't know what you were going to get out of them in some of those early season games, and that's kind of the experience that I'd rather have in the video game. I just think that when you look at something like this, that's something else that you have to factor in. And one of the ways that I've also looked at this is Madden is the simulation. College football 25 is where you can have more weird things happen. And I think that's more reflective of how college football actually is. And so, I haven't waded into too much kind of discourse around the game and, what's right, what's wrong. And I'm not going to get too worked up about that stuff. But, yeah, I mean, I'd agree when I was going through the ratings that stood out to me. But, overall, like looking at the offensive line, I thought that they kind of pegged things pretty well when you talk about the uncertainty of who might be starting at what positions, to have that, because we have the Drew Shelton, Javen Williams competition, and those guys are rated pretty closely. Vega Ioane and JB Nelson were rotating last year. Maybe you could say we'd maybe pencil in Vega Ioane as a starter right now. I don't know.
Feeling good about that.
Nick Dawkins is, he's unproven. He's been around for a while, but in terms of consistent on-field product, that's not there. Cooper Cousins is, someone with a lot of excitement. Yeah, I mean, I was a little surprised to see Donka that low, but I think that's also another thing that you chalk it up that, we're in the weeds.
Yeah.
I don't know how many of these game developers were, watching the second half of the Peach Bowl. as closely as we were. And so, I think that that's something that, if anyone finds themselves getting too worked up about anything, just kind of, you just take a step back and, say, like, you just think about another random program. Like, I played a game at Oregon, and like, as Oregon, and like, I didn't know if all these guys were real, or, if they had the right guard in the game. I was just throwing it deep to Evan Stewart and, doing things with Dylan Gabriel. So I think that that's something that, it's kind of the balancing that right there.
I think folks would get the wrong impression from just looking. If you were just outside looking in like you did and just took over a team you don't know much about, you'd think that Nolan Rucci was on his way to be the right tackle for this team based on ratings. We know that's not necessarily the case. He could get time there, but it's going to be a battle. And really what we've gathered is that Anthony Donka has done a really good for himself to remain in that role when the team resumes game action. But they got preseason camp to come. We will just kind of briefly work our way through the defense. We already talked about Devon, Jay Thomas, and kind of that cluster of defensive tackles, which is a lot of guys that are mid 70s to low 80s. I'm impressed. I feel like the one thing they really had their finger on the pulse of here is the Tony Rojas situation. I think on the surface, if you were just to look at the cumulative statistics last year and the snap counts, you got 100, maybe 110 total snaps. We know that he maximized those opportunities. So my tip of the cap over to them for having him as highly rated as an 82 as they did. And so I think when you've got two linebackers here, 84, 82, and Rojas and King, I think those are both guys that sounds right to me. But I think we both believe there's another step for them to take forward. I think Tony Rojas has a chance to jump into like national notoriety, like one of those names who's become synonymous when the Penn State defense, when we talk about the Penn State defensive unit preparing for Ohio State in early November, I think he's one of those faces that people will point to. And I think Kobe King can be too. He might actually be, when we think about last year's defense and why it was so good, he may be the guy that we forget to point out as often as we should, because he took that job and ran with it. It was Tyler Elson's job the year before. He really showed up to preseason camp. And I thought game by game, even though he may have been restricted to like 30 to 35 snaps on some occasions, wasn't getting the long run that Abdul Carter and Curtis Jacobs were as much at linebacker. I think he's going to be on the field a bunch this year. And to me, that 84 rating sounds right, but he's a guy that I think can really turn people's heads and convince folks that he's among the all Big Ten linebacker caliber as this year goes on.
Virtual Kobe King was all over the place in my game against Washington. 12 tackles, an interception. Tonight, Dennis Sutton also had an interception in that game, little zone blitz. But yeah, I mean, I think that, in terms of things accurate as we think things will go this year, Kobe King and Tony Rojas being the top 2 rated linebackers. And you talk about what we're going to see from that Penn State defense this year, formation wise, with 5 defensive backs on the field. It's going to be King and Rojas. And so I think that is something that tracks very, very nicely.
Dom DeLuca is next up at a 78. We know he's going to be a special teams captain again, though he played a lot of defense last year. And then the next linebacker up is Keon Wiley at 77. But of course, last we checked, indefinitely sidelined, and we'll learn more about that as the team resurfaces for practices, but injured during spring football. So depth, with Abdul Carter gone and with some injuries, maybe a question, but a reminder that it's really going to be a lot of 2 linebacker sets here. So you're not going to be calling upon 3 guys consistently to be out there on the field. And I know the Lions spot isn't reflected in the game, I don't think, as a standard defensive procedure. And you don't even have the guy who thinks going to play the line and Jalen Reed. But over at safety, KJ Winston with the 91, Zakee Wheatley with an 80. I think folks in the facility view him very differently than an 80 right now, considering all the buzz we've heard about him since January, it feels like. Takari Nelson's a 78 at that spot. They've got Tyrese Mills listed as a safety with a 75 rating. You don't have a few, though. Not just Jalen Reed. Lamont Payne made the move from cornerback. He's not in this game. DeJuan Lane just recently arrived as a freshman. He's not in the game. Colin Dinkins, who's gotten really rave reviews as maybe being the next man up in the line position. Khalil Dinkins' little brother, a redshirt sophomore who joined the program as a walk-on. He's not in this game. So if you're trying to play chess with this Penn State defense and you know all the pieces quite well, you may be a little underwhelmed. And if you want some pieces, they have them at cornerback. I mean, I think this really does tell the story nicely. you've got how many guys here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 guys who are rated at least a 72. And on the bottom of that list is the guy we heard had the best spring, Davian Collins. So the buzz has not reached EA on Davian Collins, who may very well be a starting cornerback for this team. But A.J. Harris and Jalen Kimber transferring in are an 82 and an 81 respectively. You've got the returning junior, Cam Miller, a leader of the room. He's an 82. And then Zion Tracy, Elliott Washington, John Mitchell, all 76s currently. Antoine Belgrave Shorter arrived on campus as well in January. He's lower rated at 68 right now. But it's going to be fun to follow. And I think if you're kind of trying to pick and choose who you're going to play with, this cornerback rating system that they have is going to make it tough for users of Penn State to find 2 guys that they're going to stick with and roll with throughout a game.
Yeah, and there's also a CPU cornerback who was a 77 mixed in here, which was a wrinkle for me in moving through the depth chart.
Who are we missing?
Kenny Wosley is the only one who isn't in the game, which also confused me a little bit more as to why this random cornerback got there with that rating. But yeah, I mean, I think as the secondary as a whole, when I played against Washington, I picked the 4-2-5 playbook, which I think is probably what basically what we're going to see from Tom Allen. And so in that you have got KJ Winston playing close to the line, Dakari Nelson and Zachy Wheatley as the deep safeties. And it's the thing where we talk about being too close to it, where I played a little bit of a game as Penn State later last night, and I was just using a 4-3, and it's the being too close to it where you're just kind of looking for Jalen Reed all the time, and the muscle memory of looking at things on the screen as you're like, okay, like where's Jalen Reed? It's one of those things that stands out to me, isn't going to stand out to the average player who's suiting up as Penn State for fun. So that's kind of, I'm like, this isn't that big of a deal, but it is a little bit different. But yeah, I mean, that cornerback group is a lot of fun. I think, looking at the different combinations, I was playing Kimber as my nickel. Who knows if that's how it'll actually look, but it was just kind of fun because you've got, a bunch of talented guys. You can do some fun things with blitzes in the game and, bring pressure, and your guys, you're pretty sure that the guys will make plays on the back end. So, once Jalen Reed gets in there, whenever that update comes in a couple weeks, maybe things will feel a little bit differently. Like you said, I am curious to see what his rating would be, because I think it should be pretty good. But again, we've watched 3 years of Jalen Reed and been talking to him for the past 2 years, so we know him a little bit better than a lot of people. So we'll see what that actually looks like.
Daniel has a full breakdown of the Penn State roster, everyone who's available to break down in terms of ratings. Tyler Calvaruso also has a piece up here on Tuesday at Lions247.com, specifically focusing on the members of the 2024 recruiting class that are featured on the roster and what their initial ratings are. And my understanding is, Daniel, much like Madden, these are ratings that will be adjusted in season. Like, this isn't just Drew Aller's an 88, and when you pick up your controller Thanksgiving weekend to play, he's going to be an 88.
I think so. I'm not completely sure on that.
Okay.
That's something that didn't pop into my head as someone who only returned to Madden like 2 years ago.
I know there are people on this beat who would have an answer for us in half a second on every detail of this video game, but maybe I'm overestimating where you're at with it. But I believe that's the way. I don't think these are just hard, set firmly for the remainder of the fall. The other thing you did get to, and we can finish here, is former familiar names here, guys who are on the roster, different points, moved on via the transfer portal. And when you look around that and kind of where these EA Sports ratings landed, 3 guys broke 80 who transferred out of this program at some point. Keandre Lambert-Smith is an 82 at Auburn. Dante Cephas is an 82 at Kansas State. And then you've got Tyler Rudolph, probably a name a lot of people have forgotten about, played defensive back here for Penn State. He's a safety for UMass now, considered an 81, so one of the premier players with that program. Anything else stand out to you? I mean, King Mack, obviously, after 1 year in college being a 79, there's a lot of room to work on for him in Alabama. But first off, there's like 15 to 20 names on this list. So anything else jump out?
Yeah, Jordan Vandenberg at a 78. I thought that he's someone that I think is a pretty high ceiling player, but there's a lot of work that needed to go into it. But we know he's got those physical tools. Malik McClain was the best wide receiver on the Arizona State roster as a 77. Kevon Lee is in a crowded backfield at 78. Even before, and Keziah Holmes is a 78 at Florida State as well. So those two class of 2020 backs from Florida. I was texting with you and Mark even before I did this about kind of forgetting that Devin Ford was still at Notre Dame.
Year 6 guy now. Yeah.
Yeah. And so he was a 74. Lance Dixon pops up at Toledo as a 77. There's just kind of a lot of different guys, kind of a walk down memory lane. One thing just to touch on with the specialists for the Penn State roster, because we know James Franklin emphasizes special teams a lot. Chase Meyer
does not.
Chase Meyer is a 73. Sanders Sahadak was a 67, which I think is interesting. Sahadak is the default starting kicker and the default kickoff specialist, which I thought is interesting. Ryan Barker isn't in there. The only punter on the roster is a CPU punter, which I'd like to see Big Gabe in there. One thing that I remembered with Riley Thompson is that he's not an American citizen, so he can't make the NIL money. That's kind of a part of the, I guess, legal part of this, the whole NIL thing overall. And then Tyler Duzansky is in the game as a long snapper. He's listed as a tight end though, since there isn't a designated long snapper spot. So
they got like 3 names from the special teams room on there then. Yeah, not great representation for Coach Lustig, but such is the case, often living under the radar a bit. And I heard kicking's very hard. And let's face it, you look across college football every Saturday, kicking is hard in college football. It's a difficult thing.
Yeah, that meter was very new to me, and it took me a couple extra points to figure out how to actually do it. And then I couldn't figure out why my kickoffs weren't going that far. And we know that James Franklin isn't scared to make a change at kickoff specialist, but I let Sanders Sahadak figure it out and ride it out for the rest of that game. But I think that this is kind of a cool. I think overall, this is just kind of a cool thing to have this game back and to have the real players into it instead of going through your roster and adding in the names and going through quarterback number 15 and everything like that. And I think the one thing that I'll say is that I talked about the detail that goes into it. It really is a very gorgeous game. That the way that the lighting is, the way that the colors are. I mentioned playing as Oregon last night. I did a noon game at Autzen Stadium, and so you've got a very blue sky against the green and the yellow. Just a very cool product. Looks good. Beaver Stadium looks great. Is just hearing Mo Bamba at various points in the game is a very nice touch. I just think that there's a lot of good detail into it. As with everything that happens with these games, there's a lot of kinks to work out. But I guess it's the cool part about this kind of new age that I got into when I finally got a PlayStation 5 a year and a half ago, that you can update these things on the fly. It's not just one disc and that's what you're stuck with. So it's going to be interesting to see how this evolves over these next couple of weeks.
Good overview from Daniel Gallen. We'll keep you on that beat. Make sure you're allotting the appropriate time to playing video games this week and get back to us. This is easily the longest conversation I've had about a video game that we've ever had on the podcast about a video game, and I'd imagine it'll be the only one we have about a video game until next July when the next roster rankings drop. But hey, fun conversation, and kind of sets the stage for us a little bit as we really dive into this roster in early August and try to figure out how guys really stack up when they get on the field in the flesh in just a matter of weeks. Daniel, good to have you back. Thanks for getting back on the podcast.
Thanks, Tyler.
Great stuff from Daniel Gallen. Find his coverage over at lions247.com. I know he's going to have a few more breakdowns from the video game for our subscribers and for our readers at lions247.com, many of whom are already well underway playing this game. Before him, we have Brian Dohn breaking things down from a recruiting standpoint. Fantastic, as always. Love to get him back on board. It won't be the last time you hear from Brian on the Lions 24/7 podcast. For now, stepping aside, we'll come back with the second episode this week. I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.